Because if there is a right way to do something, then there is a wrong way. And the only way to be able to know what is right or wrong, or good or bad, is to be able to judge according to a specific idea of what constitutes what is good or bad, right or wrong. Therefore, there must be a law from within in which you are using to judge your life to determine what is right or wrong, good or evil. All humans have an intrinsic understanding that there is a moral law that dictates to us what is right or wrong, good or evil. And it shows, because even when you yourself do something you know is evil, your conscience bothers you about it, and you know that it will bother you about it, and so in according to your conscience, you do what is right and good. This exact phenomenon is described in the Bible in Romans 2 verses 14 to 15, where Apostle Paul explains, "For when Gentiles, who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them." To clarify this passage, Apostle Paul is basically explaining how even people who have never read God's laws in the Jewish scriptures still follow them, since God has written His law on the hearts of all men. For example, let's say there are two incidents, one where someone goes up to a stranger that is limping and kicks them for a sadistic kind of gratification where they enjoy the pain they caused on them, and another situation where a person sees the stranger that is limping and helps them walk by holding their hand and giving them support. How would you assess the situation? Almost everyone would say that the first person did something bad while the second person did something good. But what makes the first action good and the second action bad? Is it not because the sadist treated the limping person in a way that was far away from the ideal way to treat them? Whereas the compassionate person treated them in a way that was much closer to the ideal way to treat them? Therefore, depending on how far an action is to the ideal determines whether it is good or bad, whether it is close to the truth, which is God, and leads to life, or far from the truth, which is God, and leads to death. The compassionate person would be rewarded by the world while the sadist would be prosecuted. Therefore, morality itself rests upon how close something is to the ideal, which is God. To the atheists in the audience, this is very important, because most people say that they don't believe in God because they can't experience Him, but the ideal, the truth that points to the ideal, and God, are all one and the same. With the Holy Spirit being the truth that points to God, Jesus Christ being the ideal human that, through acceptance and imitation of Him, allows you to have a direct path and relation to God, and God Himself being the source of all ideals, the light of lights, the life of life, as described in James 1 verse 17, where it states, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." You can try it for yourself right now. Think of an ideal of anything. Doesn't that thought shine like a light compared to a decrepit version of that same thing? All ideals exist in the plane of perfection, that is heaven, and because they exist in the plane of perfection, they shine in comparison to the imperfect and decrepit versions of the same thing. However, they do not shine because of themselves, they shine because they are in the presence of God, who is in heaven. Their splendor is simply a reflection of God's original splendor. When you imagine something perfect, or see something perfect, the perfection you see in it is not because of the thing itself, but because it is a reflection of the perfection of God, who is the source of all perfection, the Father of lights. Therefore, in situations where morality is concerned, or any judgment that involves good or bad, you judge the situation depending on how close it is to the ideal, which is a light, a perfection, with all perfections being a reflection of the supreme and original perfection of God. You cannot have a right or wrong without following the light that gives the notion of what is right its splendor all the way back to the source of all lights, which is God. And so, when you sin and thus defile your character due to how you have strayed from perfection, you are farther from God, whereas if you had not sinned, thus maintaining a closer distance to perfection, you are then said to be closer to God. Or with the situation stated before, the compassionate person's actions reflected perfection much more than the sadistic person's action, therefore the compassionate person's action was closer to God, and thus can be called good, whereas the sadist's was very far, and thus can be called bad. Since there is no goodness but God, it is the distance between something and God that determines whether it is good. In the same way, the distance between something and its ideal determines whether it is right or true. And if you follow truth in a practical sense, it will lead you closer to the ideal, in the same way that if you follow the Holy Spirit, which is the Spirit of truth, it will lead you closer to God in the spiritual sense. Jesus even said in Luke 18 verse 19 to emphasize God being the source of all goodness. "Why do you call me good?" Jesus answered, "No one is good, except God alone." Meaning, even as the Son of God, and God Himself, He referred to God as the only good and not Himself as Christ. This may seem confusing, but this allows us to understand Jesus' role fully when we account for what we have been talking about concerning reflections of the ideal. Like we explained before, depending how well something reflects perfection, that is how you determine how close it is to God. Because Jesus was one with God, while still separate and His own person, it shows that Jesus lived in a way and was in a way that reflected the perfection of God completely. He was a perfect mirror to God. If you imagine the perfection of God and look at someone that is sinful, you cannot say that they accurately reflect God because they are far from the perfection that God would be if He was a human. He would need to be the perfect human, the ideal human. The sinful man fails at reflecting an ideal human, therefore you can say they fail at being a reliable mirror because their mirror is too dirty, too stained with imperfection, too stained with sin. Someone that is very kind, righteous, and upright is a much better mirror. However, to reflect the perfection of God would need for someone to be completely perfect, not just relatively. This is what Jesus' role was. He was a complete and perfect reflection of the complete and perfect God. Which he notes in John 14 verse 9, where he states, "Don't you know me, Philip, even after I have been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" And this is why he was such a gift to man by God, because in the same way you are able to create tools and instruments with much better success once you have an ideal to work towards than just fumbling around in the dark. Jesus allows us to know what the ideal man would be, and thus allows us to work closer to be that ideal by just imitating him. Furthermore, he allows us to have a direct relationship with God, since by observing, understanding, and remembering him, his life then reflects the perfection of God that is within us all. In the same way that if you observed an angry and emotional person, it would remind you of the angry and emotional side that you yourself have. When you observe Jesus, understand his story, his spirit of self-sacrifice for the greatest good on the cross, his innocence and love, his purity and his faith in God, it reminds you that you also have all those qualities within you. It reflects the perfection of God within you. As it states in Genesis 1 verse 27, "So God created mankind in his own image, in the image of God he created them, male and female he created them." And therefore, by keeping your focus on him, imitating his spirit, and following him and his teachings, you grow closer to God by growing closer to the perfection of God within yourself. This is why Jesus says in John 14 verse 6, Jesus answered, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." This is also why Christianity emphasizes Jesus Christ as being the only way, because before and after him, there has not been someone that was sinless, and thus, there has not been someone that was able to perfectly reflect God. You cannot have a direct relationship with light if your mirror is pointing away from it. There has not been one person that I have come across that has exhibited a truly sinless life like Jesus, that lived a life free of any controversy, sin, or injustice. I cannot think of one person, can you? This will ring true to many, but to be truly thorough, let's address the atheistic concerns for our way of thinking.